and welcome to today's webinar, Mastering Your Question and Answer Session, the Q&A session, how to handle it with poise and how to ensure that you have impact. When you're doing a presentation, when you're doing a workshop, one of the things that can really affect our credibility, our message, our ability to have impact is how well we do the Q&A. So let's say you've done a really good presentation and then people ask questions and then you struggle. What happens is your message, your credibility, your ability to have impact is diluted by a poor Q&A, question and answer session. And people start to think, I don't think Peter knows as much about the topic as I thought he did. That was a really good question from Fred, and Peter struggled to answer it. The reality is, if you do a good presentation and the Q&A is poor, the whole effect can be to bring your message down. So, good morning, everyone. Peter Dew's my name. Today is about how to be more effective when you move into answering questions at a presentation, a workshop, or a seminar. Let me share my screen. Mastering the Q&A session. As always, those of you who've been on my webinars before know to ask questions as we go. That's a rule that I'm putting up front. Type them into your chat or your Q&A box. If the Q&A box is not there, the chat box is open, and type in any comments. Participate by not only asking questions, but your own personal anecdotes, Q&A sessions that you've seen go well or maybe went bad, and what could they do differently. Feel free to take notes. I do record these webinars so you can watch this later on, so don't spend too much time on notes. And think and apply. Have you got something coming up? What have you done in the past? How might you handle your Q&A session differently next time to make it more effective and more credible to your message? So I've got some tips. First of all, let's set your Q&A session up for success. Let me start with some common challenges. First one is people ask questions that are unrelated to what you've spoken about. It's kind of they take you down a rabbit hole. Another problem is the same person keeps asking questions, so they hog the limelight. Another problem is when you as the speaker or trainer spend too much time on the one question and you keep talking and talking and talking, and there's no time for other questions. So how to manage this and set yourself up for success? First of all, set the rules up front. And the rules can be something like this. Please hold your questions to the end. Can I limit it to one question per person? So by limiting it to one question per person and get everyone to nod, you will then curtail those people that want to ask question after question after question, and they hog the limelight. So it goes something like this. So thanks for inviting me to speak to you today. I know there's going to be lots of questions and I've got a lot of information to cover. In order to best answer as many questions as possible, can I ask you to limit it to one question per person? If you have additional questions, please send me an email and I'll get back to you after my seminar. Everyone nods, that's the agreement. Then if someone comes in with a second or a third question, you can say, look, please, if you don't mind, Bill, we did agree one question per person. I know you've got other questions. Please send me an email. We've got another question over here, and you move over to someone who hasn't asked you that question. So what rules can you put in place up front that will help set up a successful question and answer session? Now, you can't set that rule halfway through your presentation. So Bill's asked you one question, and then he asks a second question, and then he asks a third question, and then you say, look, I'd just like to, Bill, can we limit it to one question per person? Because now I appear as if I'm being disrespectful to Bill, maybe a little bit evasive, trying to avoid the questions. But if I've set that up at the start of my presentation, at the start of my seminar, everybody knows how I'm going to manage my Q&A. The other thing you can do is set the scope of what you're going to talk about. So I'm here to talk to you today about the logistics and the planning of this new project. I'm unable to talk about budget or finances. And then you start presenting and you talk about the logistics, the planning, the time frames, and then someone comes up with a question, but Peter, that's going to cost a lot of money. My budget is already very thin. How am I going to pay for that? I can now say, look, thanks for your question. I appreciate you've got some financial constraints, but as mentioned, I'm not here to talk about budget or finance. If you have any questions around finance, then you need to go direct to our finance manager. Right, let's get back to logistics, planning, timing. So by setting the scope, the framework around what you're here to talk about and what you can't comment on, you can manage a lot of questions and answers that are outside the scope of what you're there to talk about. The other thing you can do is set the time frame and the methodologies for your questions up front. You will have noticed in this webinar, I've said, please ask questions as we go. So as I look in the chat box, no questions at the moment. So with your seminar, you can say, right, thanks for inviting me. Please feel free to put your hand up anytime during my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions as we go. That's a rule for how you're going to handle your questions. Now, if you're speaking for 20 minutes, can I suggest that you don't invite people to ask questions as you go? Because with 20 minutes, you have a very short time frame. And if you allow people to ask questions, you may end up going down that rabbit hole, taking too long to answer a question and not finish your content. So here's a rule that I would use if I had a 20-minute presentation. So thanks for inviting me to speak today. I've got a fair bit of content I want to cover. Can I ask you to hold your questions to the end? I'm going to allow 6 minutes for Q&A right at the end. Right, let's get started. So that is my rule. Now, when Bill, sorry, Bill, I keep picking on Bill. When Bill interrupts and says, oh, Peter, but what about such and such? I can say, look, Bill, if you don't mind, can you hold your question to the end? We did agree, just hold that question to the end. Right, let's get back on content, and I keep talking, and then I take Bill's question at the end. So by having these rules on how you're going to manage, how you're going to handle, what you're going to take questions on, by having them all up front, you're setting yourself up for success in your Q&A session. If you don't have those rules up front and people interrupt you and you say, look, I don't want to take questions now, you're seen as being disrespectful, maybe a little bit evasive, avoiding the question, and not easy. It's not easy to handle those situations. Whereas if you've outlined the rules, how I'm going to handle my Q&A, questions as we go, questions towards the end. Let's say it's a big conference. Let's use Slido, S-L-I-D-O. It's an app. Take out your phone, go to Slido, enter the Q code, enter the code number. Now you can type in your questions as I present, and at the end, I'll see on Slido, I'll see on my screen all the different questions you've asked me. So you can even use artificial intelligence or apps, Mentimeter, Slido to help electronically handle your Q&A session. Set those rules up front. It'll make your job a lot easier. Preparing for your Q&A. Anticipate questions. Several things you can do. What question don't you want to be asked? What question, if you're asked, is going to make you feel uncomfortable? Prepare answers to those questions. Are you delivering bad news? Are you downsizing? Are you defunding, removing dollars from a service? Are you recommending a merger of two departments? What are you presenting on? Just think for a moment, if you were an audience member and I heard this message, this unpopular message, this change message, what questions would I want to ask the speaker? And by doing that, you can prepare answers to those questions, those difficult questions, those unpopular questions. Another thing you can do is you can send out a pre-workshop survey. What's your biggest issue around public speaking? What do you hope to learn out of this workshop? Do you consider yourself a good public speaker at the moment? On a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you when public speaking? And the answers to those questions, that survey, help me prepare likely questions I'm going to get. I get really nervous, I get anxious. How can I deal with my fear? All right, I know I'm going to get a lot of questions about dealing with anxiety, dealing with nerves, preparing for a presentation, how to overcome stage fright. So what Q&A could you send out? It does two things. Number one, it helps you make sure your content matches with what people want. And number two, it sets you up for the type of questions you're going to be asked. Another thing you can do in advance is what I call Dorothy Dixes. So Dorothy Dixes are questions that are prepared. Just a moment. So your Dorothy Dixer is a question that you already know the answer to. And one of the things that we can use them for, especially as for conferences, is when you have an MC or a chairperson, someone who's going to manage the Q&A. So you're presenting at a conference and the MC or the chairperson comes on a stage and says, right, are there any questions? One of the things you can do is get the MC to ask the first question. And of course, that first question that the MC, she or he or they ask you is a question you've sent them in advance. And you have an answer for that question. So it does two things. First thing is the first question you get from the MC, you answer confidently. It gets you in the groove of answering a question because you know what the question is and you know the answer. The second thing, if it's a really good question that you've prepared, a very good Dorothy Dixer, it'll often set the scene or the theme for the subsequent questions. So people will keep asking further questions related to that first question the MC asked. That's called a Dorothy Dixer. The other thing you can do is you can take control of that yourself. You can say, right, that's the end of my presentation. I'm now going to do Q&A. So any questions? I just ask you to think about them for a moment. Now, one question I get asked a lot when I speak on this topic is, and you announce that question and then you give the answer to the question that you announced. Once again, that's a Dorothy Dixer. You know the question you're going to give yourself. You've got the answer prepared and it sets you up for success and it often sets the theme for subsequent questions. So do your preparation for your Q&A. Do a pre-workshop survey. Pretend you're an audience member listening to your presentation. What questions would you ask yourself? Are you delivering good news? Are you delivering bad news? Are you proposing a change? Are you proposing a new way of doing things? What questions would you ask yourself if you were an audience member? And do have some prepared questions up your sleeve that you can use for yourself to start the Q&A session, or you can hand over to a chairperson, an MC, to ask that first question. So handling questions with poise. And one of the things that I talk about with the Q&A, because your presentation is prepared, you know your content reasonably well, you've presented this presentation several times probably, the Q&A is new. You don't know necessarily what the questions are going to be. So remain calm while under pressure. So your body language, your smile, your facial expressions, your breathing remains the same as when you're presenting as when you're doing the Q&A. So the mistake that people make is when they get a difficult question that stumps them, that catches them off guard, is their body language collapses. Oh, yeah, look, sorry, that's a really good question. You've kind of got me there. So don't do that. Stay calm while under pressure. And an example of this is to say, that's a really good question. That's an interesting question. I love the way you're thinking. So the body language remains calm, the breathing remains calm, and that also gives you a bit of time to gather your thoughts. I'm going to give you some tips in a moment how to answer when you don't know the answer. So just hang on to that thought for a moment. So acknowledge your questions. That's a great question. And in my own philosophy, and part of the rules you can give people is, by the way, there's no silly questions. So feel free to ask anything. I'm a person who stutters, and that comes up during my workshops. And one of the things I say is, feel free to ask anything about my journey as a person who stutters. And I get questions like, what causes stuttering? How did you go from not being able to speak to speaking professionally as a living? So no silly questions. And by respecting the audience and handling it with poise, everyone feels valued, everyone feels heard. So acknowledge those questions, answer those questions, even if someone asks you a question ahead of time. And as I've mentioned, hang on to that thought. I'm going to cover that in a moment. And I need to make a mental note that I need to get back to that person. So if someone asks you a question ahead of time and your content's going to be following up with the answer, just politely respect, acknowledge, great question. I'm going to answer that in a moment. And then if you're really good, you can then say, so Bill, does that answer the question you had earlier on? And Bill will either nod or he'll come back with further clarification. So stay calm while under pressure, non-verbal communication, even if it's a difficult question. So what if you don't know the answer to a question? Honesty is always important in your Q&A. And sometimes my responses are my personal opinion. So this is my personal opinion. Other people in my area of expertise will offer you other scenarios, other solutions. One of the questions I get with public speaking and how to control nerves is people say, so I was given the advice of imagine everyone being naked in the audience. What do you think about that, Peter? Well, my personal opinion is I would not recommend that. In this day of political correctness, it would be inappropriate to ever say, mention, even think to yourself that you're imagining your audience, the room of people with no clothes on. For me, I would never recommend that. That is not one strategy I would use, in my opinion, to control nerves. And that is my opinion. I think that's a wives' tale. That's old advice. I don't think it works. However, other people may have differing opinions. So the honesty is that's my opinion. Some areas in your expertise, science fields, there will be a right and wrong answer, and you'll give that answer using your knowledge and expertise. So if you don't know the answer, take it on notice. Our politicians will often in Parliament say, thank you for that question, I'll take it on notice. And they're given 72 hours to respond back to Parliament. Now, in my view, 72 hours is too long for at a meeting, me as a professional speaker, I'll get back to you by close of business by the next day. Let me find out and I'll get back to you. That's called taking it on notice. Really great question. I haven't seen that article yet. I haven't read that research. Let me find out and get back to you early tomorrow morning. The other thing you can do if you don't know the answer is use the wisdom of the room. Bill, that's a really good question. I haven't heard that scenario before. Has anyone else in the room, can anyone else in the room comment on Bill's question? And that way I'm using the wisdom of the room, bearing in mind the wisdom of the group I'm training to collectively is greater than my individual wisdom. So it is possible that the room will have the answer. Now, the risk of going to the room is someone might come back with a left field answer, or they might come back with a long, protracted response, and you lose control of your presentation. So going back to a short presentation, 20 minutes, and you've left 6 minutes for Q&A, I wouldn't go, does anyone in the room know the answer? Because they may take 6 minutes, and that's my whole Q&A gone. With a 20-minute presentation with 6 minutes Q&A, I would probably say, thanks for your question, Bill. I'm going to take that on notice. I'll get back to everyone in the room first thing tomorrow morning. Another good thing with Q&A is post-seminar, post-workshop, post-presentation follow-up. So you've done your Q&A. Don't be afraid to follow up with those questions and a little bit more depth and even some references that you have used to support your responses. And you may not know the references just off the top of your head when someone asks you a question, and you might know from your knowledge that this is how to deal with the question and you answer it. Then you can follow up with a reference to a Harvard Business Review or maybe a YouTube or some other research. You can create a frequently asked question document and you can send it out afterwards. And there may be questions on that document that weren't even asked. And this not only serves your audience, but it shows a greater depth of knowledge. And I often do Q&A or tip sheets as a follow-up, just as a courtesy, just to keep adding to the learning. So feel free, after your presentation, after your Q&A, don't leave it there. Feel free to follow up and do post-seminar, post-workshop support of your clients, post-workshop support of your attendees. They'll value the support, they'll value the resources that you're giving them. And it's a great way, to stay front of mind. When I do a 90-day follow-up, I'll send tip sheets, Q&A and fact sheets, frequently asked questions. And all of a sudden, someone will give me a phone call. Hey, Peter, thanks for that tip sheet. By the way, I've got another group of people I'd like trained in public speaking. When you're doing your next workshop. So there we have it. So here's some tips, summary. Set yourself up for Q&A. Frame what you're going to talk about. Do your methodology, questions as we go. We're going to use Slido, save your questions to the end. Do some preparation, some frequently asked questions, do an audit, prepare some Dorothy Dixes. Handle your questions with poise. Remain calm while under fire. Acknowledge everyone. Great question. Thanks for that question, Bill. We're going to cover that later on. So that respect, that paying and thanking the people for asking the questions, no stupid questions. If you don't know the answer. Honesty is the best policy. Take it on notice, get back to people, phone a friend. Does anyone in the room know? And of course, post-seminar follow-up really serves your audience well by giving them further tips, further information, and you can always also summarize the questions that you got during your workshop, add references, and that'll make you look really good, professional, and raise your standard, raise your competence, raise your credibility in the area which you're speaking and training. So there's my tips for setting your Q&A session up for success. A couple of workshops coming up in Karratha, Port Hedland. Next webinar, presentation skills for introverts. Introverts have great messages, have great information. Many introverts avoid public speaking. So this is a few tips just for the introvert. So if that's something that'll be of value to you, then feel free to attend that webinar on the 10th of March. Got my contact details. You know how to reach me. And of course, thanks for your participation. Really appreciate people attending. This one is recorded. So remember your Q&A. A good Q&A session elevates your credibility, elevates the success of your workshop, elevates your message. A bad Q&A, handling questions poorly, not responding well, being disrespectful can lower your credibility, can lower your influence, can lower your message. This is Peter Dew, public speaking coach and trainer, wishing you well in your next question and answer session.